Caracalla, born Lucius Septimius Bassianus in 188 CE at Lugdunum in Gaul, was a man whose life was destined to be marked by ambition, blood, and brutality. He would later take the name Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus Augustus when he became emperor, but history remembers him best simply as Caracalla, a name that derived from the long Gallic cloak he liked to wear. The child of Septimius Severus, one of Rome's most ambitious emperors, and Julia Domna, a powerful woman from the aristocratic family of Emesa in Syria, Caracalla was born into a household that combined political shrewdness, military strength, and cultural sophistication. His father, Severus, was a tough and disciplined man who rose from humble beginnings in North Africa to seize control of the empire, while his mother, Julia Domna, brought a deep connection to Eastern traditions, philosophy, and intellectual circles. From the start, Caracalla's upbringing was one of privilege, but also one of immense pressure, as he was groomed to one day carry the immense burdens of Roman rule. As a child, Caracalla was known to be restless, quick-tempered, and prone to violent outbursts. Ancient historians, such as Cassius Dio and Herodian, describe him as lacking the charm or mild manners of some earlier imperial heirs. Instead, even from an early age, he displayed a disposition toward cruelty and suspicion. Severus, however, was determined to secure the dynasty he had worked so hard to create, and thus Caracalla, along with his younger brother, Geta, was elevated into positions of honor and recognition long before either boy could fully grasp the responsibilities of power. By the time Caracalla was 10 years old, he had already been renamed Marcus Aurelius Antoninus to link him symbolically with the revered Antonine dynasty. This was not merely a name change, but a calculated political move, meant to present the Severan line as natural successors to the great emperors of the 2nd century. In Roman politics, image and continuity were as powerful as armies, and Severus understood the importance of weaving his sons into Rome's legacy. Growing up in the imperial household meant that Caracalla's daily life was intertwined with politics, military affairs, and constant ceremony. Tutors trained him in rhetoric, Latin, and Greek, while military commanders introduced him to the discipline of the Roman legions. He traveled with his father often, experiencing firsthand the operations of war and governance. Yet Caracalla was not remembered for intellectual brilliance or rhetorical elegance. He lacked the philosophical bent of Marcus Aurelius or the administrative precision of Hadrian. Instead, he gravitated toward the rough life of soldiers, preferring barracks and battlefields over libraries and debates. This preference would define much of his reign, for Caracalla sought above all to be loved by the army, even if it meant being hated by the Senate and the elites of Rome. By the late 190s, as Severus consolidated his power, Caracalla was already being prepared to step into the role of co-emperor. In 195 CE, while still in his teens, he was given the title of Caesar, the junior rank to the emperor, and just 3 years later, he was elevated to Augustus alongside his father. This move effectively made him co-ruler, though in practice, Severus still controlled the empire. From this point onward, Caracalla was no longer just a young prince. He was officially one of Rome's emperors, even if the world still saw him as a boy. The decision to elevate him at such a young age was not unusual in Roman politics, for emperors often sought to establish their sons as partners in rule to prevent civil wars upon their death. Severus, however, was careful to balance power between Caracalla and Geta, which planted seeds of rivalry that would later bloom into one of the most infamous fratricides in Roman history. Life in the imperial family was anything but peaceful. Caracalla and Geta were raised side by side, but they were polar opposites in personality. While Caracalla was aggressive, domineering, and hot-tempered, Geta was quieter, more reserved, and seemingly more interested in intellectual pursuits. Ancient sources suggest that the brothers despised each other from an early age, constantly competing for attention, influence, and affection. Their rivalry was so bitter that their parents had to physically separate them at times. Even when paraded before the Roman people, the tension between them was palpable. Their mother, Julia Domna, tried her best to mediate between her sons, but her efforts were in vain. This conflict within the imperial household would not only haunt Caracalla's personal life, but also destabilize the empire itself once Severus was gone. As Caracalla entered adulthood, his character became more defined, and not in ways that bode well for Rome. He was obsessed with his image as a soldier and spent much of his time among the legions, training, marching, and seeking their approval. The army, weary of politicians and bureaucrats, often admired emperors who shared their hardships, and Caracalla deliberately cultivated this reputation. He dressed like them, ate like them, and even pretended to endure the same physical strains. He was known to walk long distances in full armor, sharing in the dust and sweat of his men, something that endeared him to the soldiers, but earned him little respect from Rome's aristocracy. He sought to embody the image of Alexander the Great, whom he idolized above all historical figures. In his eyes, Alexander represented the ideal conqueror, the fearless warrior king who commanded absolute loyalty. Caracalla often compared himself to Alexander, a dangerous comparison that fueled both his ambitions and his paranoia. The empire Caracalla inherited alongside his father was vast and diverse, stretching from the sands of North Africa to the hills of Britannia, from the Rhine and Danube frontiers to the deserts of Mesopotamia. Governing such an empire required not only military strength, but also political compromise and administrative skill. Yet Caracalla showed little interest in the intricacies of governance. His priorities revolved around maintaining the loyalty of the legions and stamping out any hint of opposition. The Senate, once the heart of Roman politics, was reduced to a ceremonial body under Severus and continued to lose significance under Caracalla. He treated senators with open disdain, seeing them as obstacles rather than partners. In the young emperor's eyes, Rome's true backbone was the army, and he would go to great lengths to ensure that soldiers were rewarded and civilians were kept under control. Even in these early years of co-rule, Caracalla's darker tendencies emerged. He was notoriously suspicious, quick to see conspiracies where there were none. He developed a reputation for sudden bursts of violence, sometimes ordering executions without trial or evidence. Those who displeased him or questioned his authority often met grim fates. Although his father's presence restrained him somewhat, Caracalla's nature was already becoming apparent to those around him. Stories circulated of his cruelty toward servants, his harsh treatment of those beneath him, and his unwillingness to forgive even the smallest perceived insult. Unlike emperors who sought popularity through generosity or public works, Caracalla relied on fear and intimidation. This strategy won him obedience, but it also created deep resentment that would follow him throughout his reign. When Caracalla turned 15, he was married to Plautilla, the daughter of the powerful Praetorian prefect Gaius Fulvius Plautianus. This union was meant to strengthen ties between the imperial family and one of the most influential men in Rome. Plautianus was a close ally of Severus and wielded enormous power, effectively acting as second in command. The marriage, however, was a disaster from the start. Caracalla detested Plautilla, describing her as arrogant and insufferable, and he treated her with cruelty and disdain. Their union produced little harmony and no enduring legacy. Caracalla even openly expressed his wish to kill both Plautilla and her father, an alarming sentiment given Plautianus's position. Eventually, his hatred bore fruit. Plautianus was accused of treason and executed, while Plautilla was exiled and later killed at Caracalla's orders. This episode revealed the young emperor's ruthless streak. Family ties, political alliances, or personal relationships meant nothing to him when set against his own desires and suspicions. Through all these events, Septimius Severus remained the dominant figure, guiding both Caracalla and Geta while maintaining control of the empire. Yet Severus was aging, and the future loomed large. He was keenly aware of the animosity between his sons and feared what might happen after his death. Ancient accounts claim that Severus repeatedly urged them to cooperate, to live in harmony, and to rule jointly for the good of Rome. His advice, however, fell on deaf ears. Caracalla, consumed by ambition and envy, had no intention of sharing power. For him, Rome could not be ruled by two emperors. There could only be one. The seeds of a tragic conflict had already been planted, and the stage was set for one of the bloodiest fraternal rivalries in Roman history. By the year 200 CE, Caracalla was no longer just a boy emperor under his father's shadow. He had grown into a man of 22, hardened by military campaigns, emboldened by his position, and increasingly intolerant of anyone who might threaten his dominance. His relationship with Geta remained bitter, their hostility so obvious that it divided not only the court, but also the wider empire. Supporters of Caracalla and Geta often clashed, and whispers of civil war circulated even before Severus's death. The Roman people, weary of uncertainty, hoped that the brothers might reconcile, but those hopes were in vain. Caracalla's path was already set, and it was one paved with suspicion, jealousy, and violence. The young emperor's personality was further shaped by his father's military campaigns. Severus led his sons into battle in Britannia, where they witnessed firsthand the hardships of frontier warfare. Caracalla relished the experience, donning armor, marching with the troops, and attempting to present himself as a true warrior. While his contributions were more symbolic than practical, the image of Caracalla as a soldier emperor was being forged. These campaigns also revealed his obsession with Alexander the Great, for he often styled himself in imitation of the Macedonian conqueror, dreaming of Eastern conquests that would rival those of antiquity. This vision would later play a significant role in his reign, driving his ambitions far beyond the borders of Rome. By the time Severus's health began to decline, Caracalla's ambitions were sharper than ever. He was already dreaming of sole rule, and nothing, not even his brother, would stand in his way. The empire stood at a crossroads, with a dynasty that had brought stability now threatened by internal conflict. Caracalla, shaped by a youth of privilege, rivalry, and military life, was on the cusp of taking full control. But the manner in which he would seize power and the brutal acts that would define his reign were yet to unfold. The story of Caracalla was only beginning, and already it was steeped in blood and betrayal. Caracalla's reign entered a more complex phase as he fully assumed the responsibilities of sole emperor after the death of his father, Septimius Severus, in 211 CE. To understand the events of these years, it is important to trace both the personal relationships within the Severan family and the broader geopolitical situation of the Roman Empire at that moment. When Severus passed away in Eboracum, modern York, in Britain, the empire stood at a precarious balance. It had been stabilized by Severus' disciplined administration and military campaigns. But beneath the surface there were tensions, rivalries, and political undercurrents that threatened to destabilize the unity of the empire. Caracalla and his younger brother Publius Septimius Geta were both named co-emperors by their father. This arrangement seemed, at least on paper, to provide continuity and avoid civil strife. But anyone familiar with Roman politics would have recognized the seeds of inevitable conflict. Two young emperors, both ambitious, both brought up in a household where imperial power had been absolute, were unlikely to tolerate sharing authority for long. Caracalla was in his early 20s at this time, hardened already by years spent on campaign with his father. He had grown accustomed to the life of soldiers, the rigors of the march, the sights of war, and the discipline of camps. He saw himself as a warrior first, a soldier emperor, cut from the mold of figures like Alexander the Great. This martial identity shaped his outlook. And it also made him impatient with the intricacies of governance, diplomacy, or administration. Geta, on the other hand, was a little younger, perhaps more inclined toward civilian life, and often characterized by ancient writers as less aggressive than his brother. Their differences in temperament and ambition were only magnified by the stakes of imperial rule. The Roman Senate, the people of Rome, and the legions all became parties to the rivalry between the two brothers. Caracalla and Geta returned to Rome after their father's death with all the pomp of imperial succession. The Senate dutifully recognized both as co-rulers, granting them the titles of Augustus. Coins were minted with their joint portraits. Inscriptions celebrated their shared authority, and official decrees carried both names. Yet even as Rome attempted to present an image of harmony, the reality was very different. The imperial palace itself had to be divided between the two brothers, with separate living quarters and retinues, because their mutual hostility had already reached such a level that violence seemed possible at any moment. Ancient accounts tell us that even meals had to be arranged separately, and that attempts to bring them together usually ended in quarrels. In these early years of joint rule, the empire witnessed a dangerous paralysis. Decisions required the approval of both emperors, and with their rivalry growing ever more bitter, agreement was rare. Provinces looked anxiously at Rome, fearing civil war. The army, which was always the ultimate arbiter of power in the empire, was divided in its loyalties. Some legions favored Caracalla, remembering his presence on campaigns with Severus. Others leaned toward Geta, who had also earned popularity, especially among certain groups in Rome, who saw him as more approachable and less severe than his brother. The mother of the two emperors, Julia Domna, played a crucial role during this tense period. She had long been a central figure in the Severan dynasty, serving not just as empress, but as a political counselor and advisor. Intelligent and influential, she worked tirelessly to mediate between her sons, urging reconciliation and warning of the dangers that division posed to the empire. But despite her efforts, the hostility between Caracalla and Geta only deepened. Each saw the other as a rival rather than a partner. The ancient historians, particularly Cassius Dio and Herodian, emphasize the poisonous atmosphere of these years. They describe a Rome in which factions formed around the emperors, courtiers maneuvered for favor, and whispers of treachery abounded. Caracalla's personality, marked by suspicion and ruthlessness, made matters worse. He was quick to see betrayal everywhere, and his natural impatience with compromise made any shared governance almost impossible. As 211 turned into 212 CE, tensions reached a breaking point. Caracalla, consumed by his ambition and unwilling to share the imperial throne, began to plot against his brother. The sources report that Julia Domna tried desperately to prevent the situation from escalating, but her appeals fell on deaf ears. Caracalla's calculation was simple. So long as Geta lived, his own position was insecure. The empire could not function with two rulers locked in constant animosity, and Caracalla believed that only through eliminating his brother could stability and his personal supremacy be ensured. The imperial palace in Rome was the setting for one of the most infamous murders in Roman imperial history. Caracalla invited Geta to a supposed meeting of reconciliation in the apartments of their mother. Julia Domna was present, perhaps believing that she could finally mediate peace between her sons. In some accounts, Caracalla himself struck the first blow, while others suggest he simply gave the order. Geta was cut down in his mother's arms, dying as Julia tried in vain to protect him. Julia herself was left bloodied, holding the lifeless body of her younger son, while Caracalla claimed the sole mantle of emperor. It solved the immediate problem of rivalry, but it unleashed consequences that would haunt him for the rest of his rule. To consolidate his position, Caracalla ordered a purge of Geta's supporters. Thousands were executed, including friends, advisors, and military officers who had shown loyalty to the dead co-emperor. Caracalla had eliminated his brother, but in doing so, he stained his rule with the taint of fratricide. Even in a culture familiar with violence and assassination, the murder of a brother in his mother's presence carried a special horror. The Senate, ever pragmatic, had no choice but to ratify Caracalla's sole authority. They issued decrees condemning Geta's memory, erasing his name from inscriptions, removing his image from coins, and obliterating his presence from public monuments. This practice, known as damnatio memoria, was meant to ensure that Geta would be forgotten, that his memory would be consigned to oblivion. But the very intensity of the effort ensured that the memory lingered, for people remembered all too well what had been erased. Caracalla's insistence on obliterating his brother's legacy spoke volumes about his fear of lingering opposition. Having secured sole power, Caracalla faced the challenge of legitimizing his reign in the eyes of the empire. The stain of fratricide required counterbalance, and Caracalla turned increasingly to the army as his foundation of support. He lavished favors on the soldiers, increasing their pay and granting them privileges. The loyalty of the legions became his shield, insulating him from the hostility of the Senate and the unease of the people. For Caracalla, the army was not only a political necessity, but a reflection of his personal identity as a soldier emperor. He dressed, spoke, and acted like a soldier, often mingling with the rank and file, eating their food and sharing their hardships. This won him admiration from the military, even as it alienated other parts of Roman society. At the same time, Caracalla sought to project an image of grandeur and universality. In 212 CE, he issued one of the most significant edicts in Roman history, the Constitutio Antoniniana, or Antonine Constitution. This decree granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. Prior to this, Roman citizenship had been a privileged status, extended selectively to provincial elites and certain communities. By extending citizenship universally, Caracalla both reshaped the nature of the Roman state and increased the empire's tax base, since citizenship carried obligations as well as privileges. The motives behind the edict were likely mixed. Some historians argue that Caracalla sought to increase tax revenues to fund his military expenditures. Others see it as part of his desire to link himself to the ideal of Alexander the Great, presenting himself as a ruler over a united and cosmopolitan world. Whatever the motivations, the edict was transformative, ensuring that Roman identity would henceforth encompass nearly all the empire's free population. The Constitutio Antoniniana illustrates the paradox of Caracalla's reign. On the one hand, it was an act of inclusion, extending the rights of citizenship to millions. On the other, it was driven by the need to extract more revenue and secure loyalty for a regime stained by murder and fear. His reign was one of extremes: generosity to the army, brutality to opponents, universality in citizenship, exclusivity in power. Meanwhile, Caracalla's personal life reflected his obsession with martial identity and his emulation of Alexander the Great. He dressed in Macedonian style, carried a sword modeled on Alexander's, and even organized a corps of soldiers to resemble Alexander's famous phalanx. His admiration for Alexander bordered on obsession, and it became a guiding principle of his foreign and domestic policies. He sought conquest in the East, presenting himself as a new Alexander destined to extend Roman power into the lands once ruled by Persia. Rome itself was not neglected during these years, although Caracalla's focus remained primarily military. One of his most enduring contributions was the construction of the Baths of Caracalla, begun around 212 CE. These massive public baths were among the largest and most impressive in the Roman world, a symbol of imperial munificence. They provided Romans with not only facilities for bathing, but also gyms, gardens, libraries, and spaces for social gathering. The baths became a physical monument to Caracalla's reign, projecting an image of grandeur and permanence, even as the emperor himself was consumed by paranoia and ambition. The purges following Geta's death had set a precedent, and Caracalla continued to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat. Yet the emperor's reliance on the army ensured that his power remained secure. He raised their pay to unprecedented levels, distributed donatives, and ensured that their loyalty was rewarded in tangible terms. The next phase of his reign would see him launch campaigns in Germania and the East, further entwining his destiny with the army and with his dream of emulating Alexander. But the legacy of fratricide never left him. The murder of Geta had defined his rule, shaping both the policies he enacted and the fears that haunted him. Rome had gained a sole emperor, but it had lost something intangible, the sense of stability and continuity that Severus had tried to build. Instead, it had a ruler whose power rested on violence, whose legitimacy was questioned, and whose ambitions drove him toward endless war. They revealed the central themes of his rule: a deep reliance on the army, an obsession with Alexander, a drive for universalism through citizenship, and a ruthless elimination of opposition. These years also demonstrated the costs of his path. Rome's senatorial elite grew increasingly alienated. The imperial court lived in constant fear, and the empire itself became ever more dependent on the goodwill of the legions. Caracalla had secured power, but at what cost? His reign stood as a testament to the possibilities and perils of absolute rule, to the fine line between visionary leadership and brutal tyranny. And as events unfolded, the consequences of his choices would reverberate far beyond the walls of the palace, where Geta had fallen in his mother's arms. Caracalla's reign entered a phase that revealed more vividly the contradictions of his character. His ability to captivate the Roman legions through generosity and shared hardship, while simultaneously alienating large portions of the civilian population through cruelty, paranoia, and excessive taxation. The narrative of this period highlights not only his continued ambition, but also the harsh realities of maintaining power in an empire that spanned continents and cultures. By this stage, Caracalla had already shown himself as a ruthless man who did not hesitate to eliminate even his closest family members to secure his throne. Yet he was also a ruler who understood the psychological bond between emperor and soldier, a bond he exploited to sustain his position amidst growing discontent across the provinces. Following the murder of his brother Geta in late 211 CE, Caracalla devoted significant energy to reshaping his public image and ensuring that any memory of Geta was systematically erased. The Damnatio Memoria was one of the most thorough in Roman history. Statues of Geta were destroyed, inscriptions bearing his name were chiseled out, and paintings were defaced. Caracalla's obsession with obliterating Geta from the public consciousness stemmed not only from a desire to appear as the sole legitimate ruler, but also from a deep sense of insecurity. In Roman culture, the memory of the dead carried immense symbolic power, and Caracalla knew that as long as Geta's name persisted, so too did the shadow of his legitimacy crisis. This campaign of erasure was brutal, extending even to the lives of Geta's supporters. Many senators, knights, and even ordinary citizens suspected of harboring sympathy for Geta were executed or exiled. The imperial palace became a place of constant suspicion and bloodshed, reflecting Caracalla's growing paranoia. However, Caracalla also recognized that the Senate's support was tenuous and largely superficial. He could not rely on the traditional elite for loyalty, so he turned instead to the Roman army, who became the cornerstone of his reign. His relationship with the legions was perhaps the defining feature of his rule. From the outset, Caracalla positioned himself as a soldier emperor, living and campaigning alongside the troops rather than remaining ensconced in Rome's palatial luxury. He ate their food, shared their tents, and marched long distances in armor. This performance of solidarity earned him an enduring respect among the soldiers, who came to see him not as a distant ruler, but as one of their own. To cement this bond, Caracalla lavished gifts upon them, often depleting the imperial treasury in the process. One of his earliest and most significant acts of generosity was the doubling of the donative paid to soldiers upon his accession. These massive financial rewards endeared him to the military, but placed enormous strain on the empire's finances. To sustain these expenditures, Caracalla had to find new sources of revenue. This necessity directly influenced one of his most famous and controversial policies, the Constitutio Antoniniana, also known as the Edict of Caracalla, issued in 212 CE. This decree extended Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, a move that has long been debated among historians. On the surface, the edict appeared to be a gesture of inclusivity, a magnanimous act that symbolized the universality of the Roman state. By granting citizenship to provincials, Caracalla ostensibly broke down barriers that had distinguished Romans from non-Romans, creating a more unified empire. For many in the provinces, this was a momentous change, as citizenship carried legal privileges, such as the right to own property under Roman law, marry legally, and appeal to Roman courts. It was also a symbolic recognition of their place within the empire, bridging cultural and political divides. Yet, Caracalla's motivations were far from purely altruistic. Scholars widely agree that the primary reason behind the edict was financial. Roman citizens were subject to specific taxes that non-citizens were exempt from, particularly the inheritance tax and the tax on manumission of slaves. By extending citizenship, Caracalla dramatically widened the tax base, thereby generating much-needed revenue to fund his military expenditures. Thus, while the edict reshaped the socio-political structure of the empire, its practical purpose was rooted in the emperor's desperate need to finance his army. The Constitutio Antoniniana had profound and long-lasting consequences. While it did expand the reach of Roman law and culture, it also diminished the prestige of citizenship, which had once been a prized status symbol. Before Caracalla, citizenship was something to aspire to, a mark of distinction that separated Romans from the vast populations they governed. After the edict, citizenship became commonplace, stripping it of much of its former exclusivity. This act subtly transformed the identity of the empire, making it less a Roman state in the narrow sense, and more a cosmopolitan empire that encompassed diverse peoples under a shared legal framework. At the same time, Caracalla's domestic policies reflected a deep mistrust of the Senate and aristocracy. The Senate had never forgiven him for murdering Geta, and many senators feared they might fall victim to his capricious wrath. In return, Caracalla openly despised the senatorial elite, considering them weak and treacherous. He limited their influence, often humiliating them with public displays of contempt. This antagonism eroded the already fragile relationship between emperor and senate, further isolating Caracalla within the political structure of Rome. But if Caracalla's rule at home was marked by suspicion and brutality, his reign on the frontiers was characterized by ceaseless military campaigns. He was obsessed with emulating the great conquerors of history, particularly Alexander the Great. From a young age, Caracalla had idolized Alexander, often dressing in Macedonian attire and surrounding himself with imagery and references to the legendary king. He harbored dreams of replicating Alexander's conquests, envisioning himself as a new world conqueror who would extend Roman dominion into the east. This obsession shaped much of his foreign policy. Caracalla launched campaigns against the Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube, seeking to secure Rome's northern borders. He personally led expeditions into hostile territory, conducting raids and constructing fortifications. Though these campaigns achieved mixed results, they reinforced his reputation as a hands-on military commander. For the soldiers, the sight of their emperor fighting alongside them was a powerful symbol of unity and courage. For the empire, however, these campaigns drained resources and contributed to the financial strain already caused by his generosity to the army. Perhaps more telling of Caracalla's ambitions was his campaign in the east. His fixation on Alexander the Great culminated in a planned invasion of Parthia, Rome's long-standing rival in Mesopotamia. To prepare for this endeavor, Caracalla spent significant time in the eastern provinces, traveling through Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. His journey through these regions provided a stage for extravagant displays of power and cruelty alike. One infamous incident occurred during his visit to Alexandria in 215 CE. The Alexandrians, known for their wit and biting satire, mocked Caracalla mercilessly, particularly over his fratricide. Their jokes and insults infuriated the emperor, who responded with extraordinary violence. He invited the city's notables to a staged assembly, only to have them massacred by his troops. What followed was a general slaughter of the population, with thousands killed in the streets. This atrocity, remembered as the Massacre of Alexandria, shocked the ancient world and cemented Caracalla's reputation for cruelty. It also revealed the fragility of his rule. His legitimacy was so insecure that even ridicule could provoke a bloodbath. The massacre at Alexandria did not deter Caracalla from pursuing his ambitions in the east. He used the campaign against Parthia as an opportunity to indulge his fantasies of emulating Alexander. He recruited heavily among the provinces, gathered a massive army, and envisioned himself as a liberator who would unite the East under Roman rule. His propaganda machine worked tirelessly to present him as the heir of Alexander, spreading imagery that linked him to the Macedonian conqueror. Statues, coins, and inscriptions often depicted Caracalla in heroic poses, projecting the image of a warrior emperor destined for greatness. Yet behind this facade of glory lay an empire burdened by economic hardship, political instability, and widespread resentment. Caracalla's lavish spending on the army, combined with his constant warfare, had drained the treasury. Taxation was heavy and often resented by the provinces. The Senate, alienated and powerless, seethed with hostility. The common people, who bore the brunt of his taxes and endured his cruelty, lived in fear rather than admiration. Only the soldiers, whose loyalty he purchased with gold and shared hardship, remained steadfast supporters. Thus, as Caracalla's reign moved forward, the contradictions deepened. He was adored by his soldiers, but hated by the Senate and much of the civilian population. He dreamed of world conquest, but left the empire financially exhausted. He sought to be remembered as a new Alexander, yet his legacy was increasingly defined by bloodshed and tyranny. The stage was set for the final acts of his rule, where his ambitions in Parthia and his reliance on the army would lead to both triumphs and fatal vulnerabilities. Caracalla's reign, as the years moved into its final phase, became ever more marked by a combination of personal paranoia, militarization of the empire, and his relentless pursuit of glory through war and conquest. The emperor, who had already left a bloody legacy with the massacre at Alexandria and countless purges in Rome and beyond, turned more and more toward external adventures as a way to secure his own legitimacy and leave behind the kind of heroic reputation he admired in figures like Alexander the Great. The notion that he saw himself not merely as a Roman emperor, but as a world conqueror was reinforced by his policies, his rhetoric, and his campaigns, especially in the East. Yet alongside these ambitions, Caracalla's erratic behavior and ruthlessness alienated many of those around him, setting the stage for betrayal and his eventual downfall. One of the most significant undertakings of this later phase of Caracalla's reign was his great campaign against the Parthian Empire. The Parthians, Rome's traditional rivals in the East, had long been both a source of frustration and fascination for the Romans. Generations of emperors and generals had sought to subdue them, from Crassus, who had met his death at Carrhae, to Trajan, who had briefly extended Roman power deep into Mesopotamia, though his conquests proved unsustainable. Caracalla, drawn by his obsession with Alexander the Great, whose own campaigns had carried him through Asia into the heartlands of Persia, imagined himself destined to accomplish what others had failed to do. He dreamed of humbling the Parthians, securing Roman dominance, and presenting himself as a conqueror on par with the greatest figures of antiquity. Before the Eastern campaign began in earnest, Caracalla undertook a grand tour of the provinces, consolidating his control and projecting his power. He visited Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, in each place both currying favor and punishing resistance. The visit to Egypt in 215 CE is particularly remembered for its brutality. At first, Caracalla played the role of the gracious emperor, touring Alexandria and engaging with the local elite. But soon the atmosphere turned darker. Ancient sources describe how, after the Alexandrians mocked him with satirical plays and songs, Caracalla devised a pretext to summon the city's leading citizens to a gathering under the guise of offering them a feast. Once assembled, however, his troops fell upon them and slaughtered thousands. The massacre at Alexandria shocked the Roman world and revealed the extent of Caracalla's vengeful nature. Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, was left subdued and terrorized, ensuring that its grain shipments to Rome would continue without disruption. From Egypt, Caracalla marched into the eastern frontier regions. His propaganda began to emphasize his role as a military leader of almost superhuman stature. Coins and inscriptions portrayed him as a soldier emperor, ever ready for battle, hardened by discipline, and uniquely favored by the gods. Unlike some of his predecessors, Caracalla did not merely pose as a soldier. He lived among the legions, sharing their food, sleeping on the ground, and exposing himself to the same hardships as the common soldiers. This practice won him genuine loyalty from many in the army, who saw in him an emperor who respected their sacrifices. The soldiers were, in many ways, his only true base of support. Caracalla's eastern ambitions crystallized in his dealings with the Parthian royal family. At the time, the Parthian Empire was experiencing internal strife, with rival claimants vying for the throne. Caracalla sought to exploit this instability. He approached Artabanus IV, the reigning Parthian king, under the guise of friendship and diplomacy. According to the ancient historian Cassius Dio, Caracalla proposed a marriage alliance with Artabanus's daughter, ostensibly to unite Rome and Parthia in peace. Artabanus, cautious but flattered, eventually agreed. A great wedding celebration was arranged, with the Parthians gathering in large numbers to witness the union of their princess to the Roman emperor. Yet Caracalla had no intention of honoring his promise. On the day of the festivities, as the Parthians celebrated in good faith, Caracalla gave the order for a massacre. Roman soldiers fell upon the unsuspecting guests, cutting them down mercilessly. Artabanus himself barely escaped with his life, but countless others perished. The treachery outraged the Parthians and destroyed any possibility of peace. Caracalla's plan, it seems, was to weaken Parthia by decapitating its leadership in one swift blow, paving the way for Roman domination. Instead, it provoked a furious response and set the stage for renewed conflict. In the aftermath of the massacre, Caracalla led his forces deeper into Mesopotamia, launching raids and devastating towns. He styled himself as a new Alexander, marching eastward and preparing for a great confrontation with Persia. His actions were accompanied by grandiose propaganda, with coins depicting him as a heroic conqueror and inscriptions celebrating his victories, however exaggerated they may have been. Yet the campaign was less decisive than he had hoped. Though Roman forces inflicted damage and instilled fear, they did not succeed in bringing the Parthian Empire to its knees. The Parthians, resilient and resourceful, regrouped, and the war dragged on without a clear resolution. At the same time, Caracalla's internal policies continued to reflect his fixation on the military. His administration was increasingly oriented towards supporting the army, both financially and symbolically. The Constitutio Antoniniana, his famous edict granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, is often interpreted as both a bold and pragmatic move. On one hand, it extended the prestige and privileges of citizenship, fulfilling a long process of integration that had begun centuries earlier. On the other, it ensured a larger pool of taxpayers and, importantly, potential recruits for the army. By tying more people directly to the Roman state, Caracalla reinforced the militarized nature of his regime. Life in Rome during these years was marked by a sense of fear and oppression. The emperor's spies were everywhere, and his suspicion of the Senate grew more acute. Senators and aristocrats who aroused his envy or distrust were swiftly eliminated. Even his own relatives were not safe, as Caracalla was consumed by paranoia that others might seek to usurp his throne. His younger brother Geta, co-emperor for a time, had already been murdered at Caracalla's instigation, and the emperor's brutality in erasing Geta his memory through the widespread practice of damnatio memoria was a reminder of his merciless approach to power. Geta's supporters, both real and imagined, continued to suffer under Caracalla's reign. Despite this, Caracalla maintained a certain popularity among the common people and the soldiers. His construction projects, such as the magnificent baths of Caracalla in Rome, provided both employment and enduring monuments to his name. The baths, vast and opulent, were designed not only for hygiene but for leisure and socializing, complete with libraries, gardens, and exercise facilities. They stood as a testament to the wealth and ambition of the empire, as well as to Caracalla's desire to be remembered as a benefactor to the Roman populace, even as he terrorized the elite. The emperor's obsession with Alexander the Great only deepened as his reign went on. Ancient writers tell us that Caracalla, dressed in Macedonian-style clothing, carried a sword modeled after Alexander's, and surrounded himself with an elite corps of troops he referred to as his phalanx. He reportedly visited sites associated with Alexander's life, paying homage and attempting to draw a direct line between himself and the legendary conqueror. To his mind, he was not simply ruling Rome, he was reenacting the conquests of Alexander, bringing East and West under his dominion. Yet this delusion only highlighted the gap between his aspirations and reality. Unlike Alexander, whose charisma and genius inspired loyalty across cultures, Caracalla ruled through fear, violence, and treachery. As the Parthian War continued, the strain on the empire's finances grew ever heavier. The costs of maintaining large armies in the east, combined with Caracalla's lavish spending on construction and games, forced the government to debase the currency further. Inflation rose, and economic discontent simmered. Nevertheless, the emperor remained fixated on his military campaigns, convinced that one decisive victory would secure his place in history. In the spring of 217 CE, Caracalla was traveling through Mesopotamia, preparing for another offensive against the Parthians. He stopped near the city of Carrhae, infamous in Roman history as the site of Crassus's disastrous defeat centuries earlier. Here, fate would catch up with him. Caracalla, ever careless of his own safety, had developed the habit of wandering away from his guards to relieve himself or perform rituals. On April 8, 217 CE, during one such moment of vulnerability, a soldier named Justin Martialis, acting on a conspiracy led by the Praetorian prefect Macrinus, struck him down. The emperor, who had sought to rival Alexander the Great, was cut down in his prime at the age of 29. Caracalla's assassination was greeted with mixed reactions. Among the soldiers, there was mourning, for despite his cruelty, many admired his toughness and felt he had lived as one of them. Among the elites, there was relief, as his reign of terror had finally ended. The Parthians, meanwhile, seized the moment of Roman disarray to press their advantage. Caracalla's death symbolized both the limits of autocratic violence and the dangers of unchecked ambition. His dream of becoming a world conqueror had ended not on the battlefield in glory, but in a ditch on the eastern frontier, betrayed by his own men. The legacy of Caracalla remains a paradox. On one hand, he was one of the most brutal and tyrannical rulers Rome had ever known, responsible for massacres, executions, and widespread fear. On the other, He implemented policies like the extension of citizenship that reshaped the empire for centuries to come. His military focus anticipated the soldier emperors of the later 3rd century, and his baths remain one of the most impressive monuments of Roman architecture. His reign encapsulated both the grandeur and the violence of the empire at its height, offering a stark reminder of the fragile line between ambition and delusion. As later historians and writers reflected on Caracalla, they often emphasized his cruelty and paranoia, painting him as a tyrant who fell victim to his own flaws. Yet his story is also one of a young man shaped by immense pressure, by rivalry with his brother, by the expectations of empire, and by the intoxicating dream of emulating Alexander the Great. In the end, he left behind not the empire he had envisioned, but a cautionary tale of ambition, unrestrained by wisdom. His reign serves as a chapter in the larger saga of Rome's 3rd century, when emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, and when the empire's stability increasingly depended on the loyalty of the army rather than the institutions of state. Caracalla's later reign was increasingly dominated by the dual forces of paranoia and ambition, and nowhere were these qualities more evident than in his interactions with the Senate, the Roman people, and the army that both sustained and threatened him. As the years moved closer toward the end of his turbulent life, his rule became ever more brutal, erratic, and overshadowed by a sense of impending doom. In this period, we see a portrait of an emperor who was never at peace with himself, never secure upon the throne, and who found solace only in the company of soldiers and the promise of conquest. Part 5 of Caracalla's story focuses on his absolute alienation from Rome itself, his increasingly reckless campaigns, and the psychological decline that accompanied his lust for war and fear of betrayal. For the Senate, Caracalla had long been a disappointment. Many senators had welcomed him in the early days after Severus's death, hoping that his youth would make him malleable and that their influence might shape imperial policy. But those illusions quickly vanished after Geta's murder, for it had been senators who had supported Geta as a possible balance of power within the imperial household. Caracalla never forgave them. His suspicion of senatorial circles only grew over time, and as paranoia gnawed at him, he frequently ordered purges and executions of senators on the flimsiest charges of treason. To the Senate, Caracalla was a tyrant of the worst sort, impulsive, violent, and contemptuous of their traditions. Yet to openly defy him was nearly impossible. The army adored him, and the Praetorian Guard remained firmly under his command. The senators learned quickly to play the role of sycophants, offering endless praise for his victories and refraining from criticism. Behind closed doors, however, they despised him, and their hatred simmered as the years went on. For the people of Rome, Caracalla was a paradox. On the one hand, he lavished them with gifts such as the Baths of Caracalla, an immense architectural complex that provided a sense of grandeur and civic pride. But such spectacles were often overshadowed by his cruelty. Public executions, harsh crackdowns on dissent, and his visible disdain for traditional Roman institutions alienated many citizens. Moreover, his decision to spend less and less time in the capital only deepened the divide between ruler and ruled. He preferred to be on campaign with his legions, far from the Senate's intrigues and the city's expectations. Rome, once the beating heart of the empire, became for Caracalla a place of unease, a nest of potential conspirators. His presence there grew rarer as he pursued ambitions abroad. The army, however, was another matter. Caracalla poured enormous resources into ensuring the loyalty of the legions. His pay increases, donatives, and indulgence of their rough lifestyle made him one of the most beloved emperors among the soldiers. He ate with them, marched with them, and presented himself not as a distant monarch, but as a comrade in arms. This military populism, however, came at a staggering cost. The treasury, already strained by his father's wars and by Severus's policy of enriching the army, was nearly depleted by Caracalla's generosity. To fill the gap, Caracalla resorted to measures that sparked resentment elsewhere in the empire. Heavy taxation was imposed on the provinces, currency was debased, and wealthy citizens were often targeted with accusations of treason as a pretext for confiscating their estates. Such policies enriched the state in the short term, but created deep and lasting bitterness among the elites. One of the most infamous of these measures was the Constitutio Antoniniana, or the Edict of Caracalla, issued in 212 CE. By granting Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, Caracalla appeared at first glance to be promoting inclusivity and equality. No longer would the privileges of citizenship be confined to Italy and select provincial elites. Now millions of provincials became Romans in name and law. While modern observers sometimes view this as a progressive act, ancient sources suggest that Caracalla's motivations were more cynical. The extension of citizenship allowed him to levy new taxes, particularly the inheritance tax, on a much broader population. By turning provincials into citizens, he did not necessarily elevate their social status, but rather increased the state's ability to extract revenue from them. For the emperor, it was another way to fund his soldiers and his endless military campaigns. For the empire, it was a profound legal shift that, while born of greed, permanently transformed the identity of Rome as a multi-ethnic and multicultural polity. Yet even as he enriched and honored the army, Caracalla's paranoia made him suspicious of his own generals and commanders. He constantly shuffled appointments, ensuring that no single man held too much power for too long. This constant turnover created instability within the chain of command and bred resentment among officers, who felt they could never fully earn the emperor's trust. Still, the soldiers remained loyal, and for Caracalla, that was enough. With their support, he launched campaigns that stretched the empire's resources and exposed its vulnerabilities. His obsession with Alexander the Great grew more intense, and he sought to emulate the Macedonian conqueror by venturing into the east to confront Rome's ancient rival, the Parthian Empire. Before launching his Great Eastern Campaign, however, Caracalla turned his attention to northern frontiers. In 213 CE, he led the legions into Germania, where he claimed great victories over the tribes along the Rhine. Ancient accounts differ on the scale of these victories, with some suggesting they were minor skirmishes exaggerated into triumphs, while others depict them as serious engagements that secured Rome's borders. Regardless of the reality, Caracalla made much of these campaigns, presenting himself as a restorer of Rome as military might, and parading his achievements to both soldiers and citizens. His affinity for warfare seemed to grow stronger with each campaign, as though the battlefield was the only place where he truly felt alive and unthreatened. Following Germania, Caracalla cast his eyes eastward. The Parthians had long been Rome's great adversary in the east, and Caracalla was determined to surpass the exploits of his father, and above all, Alexander. His plan was ambitious: to launch a massive campaign into Mesopotamia, crush the Parthians, and carve out new territories that would rival the conquests of old. To prepare for this campaign, Caracalla traveled through the eastern provinces, inspecting the legions and ensuring their loyalty. In each city he passed through, he demanded honors, gifts, and displays of submission. His presence was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, for few dared resist the will of an emperor who commanded the devotion of tens of thousands of soldiers. Yet Caracalla's growing obsession with conquest only deepened his cruelty. In Alexandria, the great Egyptian city known for its wealth, culture, and intellectual traditions, he responded to a perceived insult with staggering violence. According to ancient accounts, when Alexandrians mocked him for his fratricide and his obsession with Alexander the Great, Caracalla lured many citizens outside the city under the pretext of holding a festival or a military parade. Once gathered, he ordered his soldiers to slaughter them. Thousands were massacred in what became one of the bloodiest episodes of his reign. Alexandria never forgot the atrocity, and Caracalla's reputation as a brutal tyrant spread even further. The massacre showed not only his cruelty, but also his fragility. He could not tolerate mockery or criticism, and his vengeance was always out of proportion to the slight. This act also reflected the growing instability of Caracalla's mind. Many ancient sources suggest that in these later years he was increasingly erratic, prone to sudden fits of rage and paranoia. Some even describe him as mentally unwell, haunted by visions and obsessed with omens. The murder of Geta seemed to have left permanent scars on his psyche, and his relentless fear of betrayal only deepened with time. He surrounded himself with guards, rarely allowed anyone near him without heavy security, and trusted almost no one. Yet for all his paranoia, he also exhibited recklessness, exposing himself to danger on the battlefield and relying heavily on the army's devotion to shield him from plots. Meanwhile, his relationship with Julia Domna, his mother, grew strained. Though she had been a central figure in the imperial court and wielded considerable influence in earlier years, Caracalla's increasing suspicion made him wary even of her. Julia Domna, respected for her wisdom and admired for her resilience after the death of Severus and the murder of Geta, remained a constant presence in the court, but she could no longer restrain her son's excesses. She became a witness to his decline, powerless to prevent the course of events that would soon lead to his downfall. Caracalla's preparations for his Parthian war consumed the last years of his reign. He envisioned himself leading a grand expedition eastward, not merely to defend Rome's borders, but to surpass the achievements of Alexander and leave his mark as one of the greatest conquerors of history. Yet, like so many of his ambitions, this dream was fueled more by vanity and obsession than by careful planning. The empire's finances were strained, the Senate alienated, and the provinces exhausted by taxation. But Caracalla pressed on, convinced that glory awaited him beyond the Euphrates. As he marched toward the Parthian frontier, his paranoia intensified. He began to see conspiracies everywhere, and those closest to him often suffered his wrath. The atmosphere of the court was one of constant fear, for no one knew when the emperor's suspicion might fall upon them. At the same time, Caracalla seemed determined to project the image of a warrior king, closer to his soldiers than to any civilian institution. His bond with the army was real, but it was also fragile, for loyalty purchased with gold and indulgence could easily waver if fortune turned against him. Still, Caracalla believed the legions would remain at his side, and as long as they did, he felt invincible. By 216 CE, the stage was set for his great Parthian campaign. His ambitions reached their height, and his delusions of grandeur seemed poised to collide with the realities of geopolitics, logistics, and the dangers of leading an empire from the front lines. Yet even as he prepared to march deeper into enemy territory, fate had already begun to conspire against him. His enemies, both within and beyond Rome, were waiting for the moment when his paranoia, cruelty, and recklessness would finally catch up with him. The cracks in his rule had widened, and though he still held power firmly in his grasp, it would not be long before the tide turned. Caracalla's final years reveal the paradox of a man who had achieved almost everything an emperor could want, yet remained haunted, restless, and perpetually insecure. After years of consolidating his rule, expanding the military, reshaping the empire's identity through the Constitutio Antoniniana, and crafting a persona that deliberately mirrored Alexander the Great, he seemed destined to leave behind an enduring legacy. Yet, as with so many emperors before him, his ambitions outstripped the stability of his reign, and his paranoia ultimately ensured that betrayal would come from within his own circle. By 214 CE, Caracalla was already weary of Rome itself. Where the Senate remained largely hostile, aristocrats murmured against his excesses, and memories of his fratricide refused to fade. The emperor increasingly preferred to be with his legions, far from the marble palaces of the capital, immersed in the disciplined life of the soldier and the grandeur of foreign campaigns. His obsession with Alexander the Great, which had begun as admiration, now became a consuming fixation. He sought not only to emulate Alexander's conquests, but to outdo them, believing himself to be the destined world conqueror who would finish what the Macedonian king had begun. Caracalla's eastern campaigns illustrate this dream. In 214 CE, he traveled to Asia Minor, particularly to the city of Pergamum, where he lavishly honored Asclepius, the god of healing. This was not merely piety, but also self-fashioning, for the emperor wished to associate himself with divine powers. Then he moved to Bithynia and Nicomedia, cities where Alexander's legend still resonated. To the citizens of Alexandria in Egypt, however, Caracalla showed no mercy. Long resentful of their mocking satires and their irreverent jokes at his expense, he turned on them with staggering brutality. In 215 CE, he orchestrated a massacre in Alexandria, slaughtering thousands of its inhabitants, including leading intellectuals and nobles. The bloodbath shocked the empire, for Alexandria had long been a jewel of the Roman world, a hub of culture, learning, and commerce. Yet to Caracalla, it was an enemy city that had insulted his dignity, and his retribution was merciless. This atrocity tarnished his image permanently, even among his supporters, who struggled to reconcile the image of a philosopher king and new Alexander with the ruthless butcher of Alexandria. The Alexandrian massacre foreshadowed the increasing brutality of Caracalla's later campaigns. In 216 CE, he turned his attention to the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival in the east. The Parthians, weakened by internal strife, seemed a tempting target for the emperor's ambitions. Caracalla envisioned himself not only as Rome's ruler, but as the master of the entire known world, claiming lands that even Augustus and Trajan had failed to permanently secure. In his imagination, this would be his crowning achievement, elevating him above all Roman emperors before him and placing him firmly in the pantheon of conquerors alongside Alexander. Initially, his diplomatic overtures were cloaked in civility. He proposed marriage to the daughter of the Parthian king, Artabanus IV, ostensibly to unite Rome and Parthia in peace. But beneath this facade lay treachery. When Artabanus and his retinue gathered for a supposed celebration of this alliance, Caracalla ordered a massacre, killing many nobles who had come in good faith. This act of deceit horrified contemporaries and enraged the Parthians, who now saw him not only as an enemy, but as a dishonorable barbarian in imperial clothing. Despite his betrayal, Caracalla launched a military campaign into Parthian territory, sacking towns, plundering the countryside, and declaring himself victorious. Yet these triumphs were hollow. While he had inflicted damage, he had not achieved the decisive conquest he craved. The Parthians regrouped, and the campaign dragged on without the glory Caracalla so desperately sought. His army, though loyal, began to suffer from exhaustion and disillusionment, as the endless marches and brutal campaigns yielded little reward beyond bloodshed. Nevertheless, Caracalla continued to play the role of Alexander reincarnated, even adopting Macedonian phalanx-style formations for his troops, and erecting monuments that celebrated his supposed victories. As the campaign stagnated, Caracalla's paranoia grew worse. He increasingly feared conspiracies within his own ranks. The memory of how he had murdered his own brother Geta haunted him. If he could kill family for power, what might his generals or advisors do to him? He began to isolate himself, trusting few, relying heavily on his Praetorian prefect, Marcus Opellius Macrinus. This decision would prove fatal. Macrinus, a man of humble equestrian origins rather than senatorial nobility, had risen to immense power under Caracalla, essentially becoming the second most powerful man in the empire. Yet he knew that the emperor's suspicions could turn on him at any moment, and whispers circulated that Caracalla was considering replacing him. In such an environment, survival depended on striking first. The final act of Caracalla's life unfolded in 217 CE, while traveling through Mesopotamia, near the city of Carrhae, place already infamous in Roman history for Crassus' catastrophic defeat at the hands of the Parthians centuries earlier, Caracalla prepared to continue his campaign. On April 8, 217 CE, while journeying to visit a temple, he stopped briefly to relieve himself on the roadside. It was then that one of his soldiers, acting under orders from Macrinus, struck him down with a dagger. The emperor, only 29 years old, fell, his grandiose dreams of conquest ending in a roadside ambush. News of his death spread swiftly. The soldiers, who had long revered Caracalla for his generosity and his identity as a soldier's emperor, were deeply shaken. Some mourned him as a fallen leader who had shared their hardships and embodied their ideals. Others quietly acknowledged that his cruelty, paranoia, and unending wars had brought misery. Yet none could deny that his reign, however bloody, had left an indelible mark on Rome. For all his brutality, Caracalla had been one of the few emperors who truly lived among his legions, fought in their ranks, and understood the soldier's life. His murder was not only the death of an emperor, but also the betrayal of a commander by his own trusted official. In the aftermath, Macrinus declared himself emperor, becoming the first man of equestrian rank to ascend to the throne. He immediately sought to distance himself from Caracalla's policies, suing for peace with the Parthians and attempting to calm the empire. But Macrinus could never erase the memory of his predecessor, and Caracalla's ghost lingered long after his death. The Senate, which had despised Caracalla, now condemned him formally, issuing a damnatio memoria, an attempt to erase his name and image from public memory. Statues were defaced, inscriptions erased, and official records altered to obliterate his legacy. Yet such efforts were always incomplete. The memory of an emperor as infamous as Caracalla could never be fully erased, for his deeds, both terrible and transformative, were too deeply etched into Rome's history. Caracalla's reputation in later centuries remained deeply polarizing. Ancient historians such as Cassius Dio and Herodian, both of whom lived through his reign, painted him as a cruel tyrant, a fratricide, and a butcher. Dio, in particular, despised him and chronicled his atrocities in scathing detail. Yet even these hostile sources could not deny certain achievements. His Constitutio Antoniniana had redefined Roman citizenship, extending its privileges to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. Though some critics argue this was primarily a fiscal measure to increase tax revenue, it nonetheless represented a milestone in Rome's transformation from a city-state ruling over subjects to a cosmopolitan empire uniting diverse peoples under a shared legal identity. His devotion to the army, though often ruinously expensive, strengthened the bond between emperor and soldier in ways that persisted long after his death. And his architectural projects, most famously the Baths of Caracalla in Rome, remained lasting testaments to imperial grandeur. The Baths of Caracalla, completed in 216 CE, symbolize both the magnificence and contradictions of his reign. Sprawling across acres of land, they were among the most impressive public buildings in Rome, capable of accommodating thousands of visitors at once. The complex included hot and cold baths, exercise courts, libraries, and gardens, embodying the Roman ideal of leisure and civic life. Yet this architectural marvel was funded by the heavy taxation and confiscations that made Caracalla so hated among the elite. Even as ordinary Romans marveled at the baths, the senatorial class seethed at the emperor's extortion. In this way, the baths encapsulate Caracalla as paradox, a ruler who could inspire awe through monumental achievements while simultaneously breeding resentment through his methods. Looking back, Caracalla's reign embodies both the potential and peril of imperial power. His life was a study in extremes, at once a soldier among soldiers and a despot feared by his subjects, a visionary who sought to redefine the Roman world, and a tyrant remembered for massacres and betrayal. His dream of becoming a new Alexander was undone not by foreign armies, but by his own inner circle, illustrating the fragility of autocracy in an empire where loyalty was always uncertain and ambition always lurking. Caracalla's story serves as a reminder that the emperors of Rome, no matter how powerful they appeared, were never immune to the same forces of fear, ambition, and betrayal that shaped the lives of ordinary men. Even centuries later, Caracalla continues to fascinate. To some, he remains the archetype of the cruel tyrant, his name a byword for fratricide and massacre. To others, he represents a complex figure whose reforms, military devotion, and monumental projects cannot be ignored. In him, we see the contradictions of Rome itself: immense power tempered by insecurity, grandeur shadowed by violence, and a vision of unity undermined by bloodshed. His reign, like so many in the imperial story, ended with betrayal on a lonely road, but his legacy endured carved into stone, written in laws and whispered through the ages as one of the most notorious emperors Rome ever produced.